Hello, my name is Eric Sieben, and I am one of the pastors at the Village Church. The following podcast is a ministry of the Village Church. We hope that it inspires you, that it draws you closer to Jesus, and it opens your eyes to the possibilities of living in the kingdom. Enjoy, and God bless. Father, thank you for this moment to be with friends and family and community, to listen to your word, to eat together, to enjoy friendship, to pray with each other, to sing, to cry, to celebrate. As we do all those things, Lord, I ask that you would give us courage to be authentic, to be vulnerable, to listen well, to engage. And we ask, Jesus, that your presence with us would be tangible, and that we would hold on to your goodness and your comfort and your salvation. And Holy Spirit, just bind all that together. And we ask that in your name, Jesus. Amen. All right, so for those of you who've been here for a while, you know that we're in this series on the book of Ruth. And we are actually finishing it up today. So I would just say the best way to kind of deal with the last chapter of things, or the last section, is not for me to summarize everything, because I don't want to go through all the themes of the last 4 sermons, because that would be most of my sermon. So what I'm going to do instead is just get everybody caught up, and then we're going to dive in. And so let's sort of begin the story of Ruth. First, that it's in the Old Testament. In the narrative of the Old Testament, it comes after Judges, and it tells us at the beginning that it is in the time of the Judges. And it starts out with calamity. We have Elimelech and we have Naomi heading away from Bethlehem into Moab because there's a famine. So they're going to the worst enemy of their people because there's a famine, so that they can find food. So they leave. And when they leave with their 2 sons. The story quickly goes downhill. Elimelech dies. Naomi's sons marry 2 Moabite women, and they die. And so by the end of the first chapter, we have Naomi headed back to Bethlehem with only one of her daughter-in-laws. And she is starting to narrate her story. And this is really important. She's the narrator by saying, I am changing my name from Naomi to Mara because I am bitter. God has dealt with me bitterly. I went away with much, and I have come home with nothing. Then the worst of nothing. I don't have any children. I have no grandchildren. Right? There's one little thing you might not necessarily catch, but Ruth and Orpah, the 2 daughter-in-laws, are childless when they head back. So there's nothing. And then the story picks up Ruth in chapter 1, and this says something crazy. She refuses to be sent away by Naomi and says, no, Naomi, there's something about you and about your God that your people are going to be my people, your God are going to be my God, and your lot will be my lot. Right? She says, I'm just going to be with you, which at that moment right there, if you just thought about it, I have never done that in my life. I've never just said to someone, whatever happens to you, except for my wife, right? My wife's the only one I've ever done that. Where my lot is your lot, and vice versa. We're together in it. It's not something we do, in particular, and I don't mean to beat up on you millennials, but ghosting is your thing. You got to get to own that, right? And this is a society that's like, you know what, I can't even hang out with you anymore, so I'll just pretend like I never knew you. Right? I just won't show up, I won't text you back, right? So it's a very foreign thing for all of us to say, I'm committed, I'm going to commit my whole life to your lot. So they get back to Bethlehem, and Ruth immediately heads into the fields to glean, which is, they're poor. There's a provision within Jewish law for poor people to be able to get food by going behind the harvesters. It's time of the harvest. And so Ruth's out there doing it. Now, when we read it, we may read over this quickly, but this is a very dangerous thing for a Moabite woman to be out in the fields by herself gleaning. But we run into the man, Boaz. And Boaz notices her for her love for Naomi, so her covenant faithfulness to Naomi, and he immediately tells her, I'm going to protect you. I have told all the young men to leave you alone. And here's way more food than you need. And here's some dinner. And here's fresh water, right? And that's the first two chapters. And then we hit chapter 3, and it's kind of crazy. It's kind of soap opera-y, because all of a sudden, Naomi and Ruth realize harvest is over. We're out of food. We're in a desperate place. We're two women at the bottom of the rung, and we need to do something. And so Naomi says, Boaz is our kinsman redeemer. He's our guardian. He's the man who could fix things. Here's what you do. You get all dressed up. You go to the threshing floor. You hide. You lay at his feet. He's going to wake up. He's going to have had some wine. You cover yourself with his, the end of his garment. You do all these things. And then you ask him basically to marry you and redeem my land, which is kind of crazy. But it all works out. And Boaz is actually super excited that she's even interested in him. And that's where the romantic part comes, right? But he says, there's a problem. There's actually somebody else who has the right of guardianship of you, so I need to go talk to him first. And so he goes to the city gates in the morning, and he does this cool little plan, and he kind of makes it so he's going to get Ruth. I mean, that's basically what he does. And it all works out. And we pick up our story in chapter 4, verse 13. They lived happily ever after. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife, and he made love to her. The Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. So all of us, I think, have happily ever after. We want happily ever after. Little girls ride princess bikes and think about the happily ever after, right? That's what we're told. It does strike something in us, right? Either we have one of two responses. We have, because we're like realists, we have contempt for the happily ever after, down with Disney. And the other half of us are like, oh, I want as much of the happily ever after as I can get. I want to drink it in, right? Well, this is a happily ever after in the Bible. Boaz gets Ruth. Ruth, who was barren, probably. And here's the key, because we see this over and over again in Ruth. It says the Lord enabled. Over and over again, calamity and joy are all narrated, even though there's volition, and it's obvious volition by human beings. It's narrated, God did this, right? So God provides a child. And this is the important thing of the story. Naomi starts out with no one to claim her land. Ruth has no husband and is a Moabite woman in a foreign land. And it ends with them both being protected by Boaz, and a son who can claim the land is provided. Happily ever after. That's how it works, right? And that's how we hope things will be. It seems right to us. But the question that all of us need to ask, or we do ask, is why? Why is Ruth in the Old Testament anyway? Why did Naomi and Ruth have to go through all this pain? Why did Naomi have to lose her husband, lose her two sons? Why did Ruth have to lose a husband and be moved out of her people? Why did they have to go through all these convoluted things to have a happy ending? Why do we have to suffer in all of this? And why is it that we see the suffering and we experience the suffering, but then when something good happens, somehow we forget the suffering? Right? We forget that it was brutal to get to the son. We forget that Naomi lost her first husband, only husband. So why is Ruth here? Well, I'm going to attempt quickly to answer a few of those questions for you. So instead of giving you all the answers, I'll answer a few of them. But first I want to start with this idea that we all know why. And the reason why is that you are all screwed up. And you are dumb. And you make dumb choices. And so those dumb choices hurt me and they hurt everybody else. And now as I've called you dumb, you're like, wait a second, the pastor called me dumb. And now you're trying to like figure out what that means and what. The problem is that even if we don't believe in God, we know why we suffer. It's because somehow we're all inclined to be stupid. And stupidity breeds suffering, right? There's so many of us. So we know there's pain and suffering. But the reality is that Scripture tells us the reason that we do that is that we were unwilling to submit to God and obey, and we were sent out of the garden, and we have been on this trajectory of destruction ever since. And the Old Testament and New, but the Old Testament illustrates this really well in helping us see those things. But here are some answers that I want us to think through in light of all of that. First, hope. If you read Ruth, you cannot read Ruth without taking a step backwards and reading the last verse of Judges where it comes right after. And Judges 21:25 says, in those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. Now, I cannot tell you that in the Jewish people they put Ruth in the writings, and they do not put Ruth after Judges. But the Christian Bible puts Ruth after Judges for a reason. And the reason is that for hope. Because Ruth is a story of hope. Because in the middle of chaos, and I think maybe we can identify a little bit with this, but in the middle of chaos, where there's no king, and everyone is doing what's right in their own sight, and everything is chaotic, and even the best of leaders cannot organize the Hebrew people, and things are chaotic, and if you read the book of Judges, and you get to the last few chapters, you should do some trauma therapy before you read them, because they're brutal. They're brutal. And so this story, Ruth, all of a sudden lands in this moment when everything is brutal and says, you know what? But there are people who do the right thing when everything is going crazy. And not only do they do the right thing, they commit themselves beyond what is expected. They bring love that is covenantal. I will attach myself to you and be your deliverer, be your companion, right? So as Andor, the movie, the phrase, rebellions are built on hope, right? That's a popular phrase. I would say in the Bible, revolution is built on hope. And what Ruth tells us, and we'll get to this a little bit more, but what Ruth tells us is that God is about doing something. In the midst of when everything is crazy, God is doing something with people. He's working out this bringing all things to rights. So, one of the answers of why that we have a story like Ruth is that we need hope when everything seems to be going wrong in both our life and the world around us. The second answer is that our stories are epic, right? In The Lord of the Rings, there's, Sam's talking to Frodo. It's later, but it says, there's some good in the world, Mr. Frodo, ... and it's worth fighting for. Right? There's some good in the world, and it's worth fighting for. You are part of an epic story, and yet it's very hard to believe that. Right? Ruth and Boaz and Naomi did not know that they were part of an epic story. They had no idea. But what Ruth tells us as a story is that you are part of an epic story, and your epic story and the things that happen to you, the hardships and the good things, have a ripple effect in the world because you are part of bringing the kingdom forward if you are a follower of Jesus. And even Joseph understands this. So Joseph, early on in the Old Testament, do you guys remember what happened to Joseph? He kind of had a little bit of an arrogance problem. His brothers didn't like him, and they threw him in a pit. And they were just going to leave him there to die, but they don't. They sell him into slavery. And he works his way up to being the second most powerful person in Egypt. And in the midst of that, he basically saves the known world because there's famine. And through God's guidance, Joseph is able to help Egypt prepare for that. His brothers then encounter him later on, looking for food, and this is what he says to them. You intended to harm me, their volition. But God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. Your choice, God's sovereignty. You are part of an epic sovereign story, right, of God's weaving. And your choices, from the way that you treat someone to the way that you engage, has impact. What you do can impact that story. You are part of an epic story. Ruth tells us that. We will see that. Ruth reminds us that even in the simple things, we are part of an epic story. And last, at least one of these three answers, is that happily ever after is right. It's right, guys. So when the village first started, a couple years in, these two athletes showed up, Jeremy and David. David's last name was Wolf, so we would call him Wolfie. Jeremy had just graduated from Hawaii State, or I forget which university in Hawaii, but he was a starting baseball player. David was a well-known junior college pitcher and high school pitcher here in Arizona. And they both were coaches at Push Ridge. And Jeremy became a Christian here at the village. But when they started coming, they could not stop talking to me about the Notebook. These grown men who were athletes, big, muscular, macho, watched it over and over and told me they would sob and sob. It's this sappy, frustrating, annoying love story. And they loved it. Right? Because happily ever after and the longing for that and the conflict for that, it's right. You know, there's a quote in Interstellar, the movie, it says, love is the one thing we're capable of perceiving that transcends dimensions of time and space. Right? There's something about the happily ever after being right. It awakens something in us. Boaz found Ruth. They had a baby. Revelation 21:5, God says, it says this, John speaking of God, he says, he who was seated on the throne said, I am making everything new. Then he said, write this down, for these words are trustworthy and true. Life, if you're a follower of Jesus, is moving towards happily ever after. It's moving to a life with a new body in a new heavens and earth, where you will be revealed in the fullness that God created you to be without sin or blemish. God is about making all things new. Ruth reminds us that he's doing it. He's doing it in every circumstance. So hope, you're part of an epic story. Happily ever after is right. So, with that in mind, settle in to your movie. I was hoping to have, settle in, and I was going to have a picture of a guy pop into the seat, grab your popcorn. I didn't have time to do all of that. So I'm just going to ask you to imagine that. Settle in. Get your big thing of popcorn or candy or whatever it is. You know, your bean burrito that you snuck in, whatever it is. I have snuck in entire meals into the movie theater when I was in high school. So, settle in. And we're just going to let the movie kind of land here. Starting in verse 14. The women said to Naomi, this is all in response to Ruth having a son. Praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a guardian redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you and who is better to you than 7 sons, has given him birth. So, Susan and Jim talked about this kinsman redeemer or guardian redeemer as Boaz, and Boaz is that. But the son takes the place of that redeemer in that it is the action. So having a son redeems the land, allows an inheritance to happen. Now, there's a lot of interesting things here that they say about it. First, they want him to be famous. I don't know, maybe some of you have had this experience, but I have never seen it where a mother has baby and everyone's around and they're like, the one thing we want for this baby is for them to be famous. I mean, it's not a thing. But one thing I want you to just take note of, it says that Ruth is better to you than 7 sons. 7 is the perfect number of sons to have for a Hebrew mother. And it's just saying your Moabite daughter-in-law is better than 7 sons. Now, what's interesting about all of this is how did Ruth begin? How did chapter 1 begin? With Naomi narrating her life. My life is terrible. Everything has gone to you know what in a handbasket, right? But at the end of Ruth, she's not narrating her life anymore. The community is narrating her life. The community is telling her what has happened. And I think this is a really important thing not to just go on by. Because usually as we struggle, the more we narrate our own lives, the more dark they get. And we need community to point out the actions of God in our life. And I think in chapter 4, what we see is the women, and we'll continue to see this, are narrating and reminding Naomi, you are not Mara. You are not bitter. God has not dealt with you bitterly. He has intervened and given you a redeemer and a daughter-in-law. Better than 7 sons. But what is not caught up in this story, but in the psychology of things that we might want to think about for a minute, is that it's very hard for me to have you narrate my story for me. In particular, when you're not just saying, oh yeah, that sounds tough. I'm so sorry that you have to struggle like that. When you begin to tell me, no, do you actually see what God is doing in your life? I'm like, nah, I don't want that. Right? A lot of times it's hard for us. But I think what we find in Ruth is maybe a small invitation for us to allow the community to point out the actions of God. And as a community to understand that that is part of what we do as we hold people's stories. Now, we're not trying to do it in a way where we're going to force it on them, but we're wanting them to see what God might be doing by proclaiming what is good. And that's what the women do. Then, Naomi took the child in her arms and cared for him. The women living there said, Naomi has a son, and they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. Now, it seems to indicate in the text here that Naomi and Ruth and Boaz don't name their son. The community names their son. So, those of you having a baby, the village is now instituting some new things. We're naming your children for you. No, I know that's not a possibility, even though I might like it. No, but Obed basically, roughly translated, means servant. You have Ruth, who served Naomi by giving her life to her. You have Boaz, who served Ruth and Naomi by rescuing them. So what do you get from 2 servants but a servant? And then here comes that epic part. What we find out here, right, is that Ruth is the great-grandma of David, the king. Now, I want you to catch something. Here's what I mean that you are part of an epic story. When Ruth makes her proclamation in the beginning of Ruth chapter 1 that I'm with you, Naomi, I go where you go, your God is my God. She was not thinking, and when I have a baby, he will be in the line of King David who is going to rescue Israel. He had no concept. Boaz was thinking, when I marry Ruth and save Naomi's land and I am going to be part of the rightful king of Israel, like he's going to be in my line. Didn't realize that. They just acted in the way of God and in the way of self-sacrifice. And so I want to just hammer this point down because it's really hard for you to probably grasp and me, is that you are part of an epic story even though your life may seem relatively mundane, right? I'm inviting you to narrate and think of your life that way. Ruth invites you to think of your life that way. Is that the things that are in front of you have an epic trajectory. You're part of something way bigger. Ruth and Boaz were part of something much bigger. So here come the credits. Now, if any of you are following along, you'll note that, Eric changed to the NASB. It's just for formatting. The NIV sticks everything in a long list, and I was too lazy. The NASB puts it in paragraphs. So, doesn't change anything. It's just a pure laziness. So, here are the credits. Now, these are the generations of Perez. To Perez was born Hezron, and to Hezron was born Ram, and to Ram, Adinmadab, and Adinmadab was born Nahshon, and to Nahshon, Solomon, and to Solomon was born Boaz, and to Boaz, Obed, and to Obed was born Jesse, and to Jesse, David. Now, this is really interesting. It's the credits, but Perez, he goes all the way back to Perez, which is the son of Judah. Perez came out of a really weird situation that we won't get into right now, but we did earlier. So what's happening in this credits, sometimes Sue and I'll sit and just watch the credits and look at all the names and kind of laugh at them, or they like, well, I wonder what that job's like, because there are a lot of jobs on a movie. These are really important because how Perez came about was in a very, let's just say, not biblical way. But what these credits are saying is, in the end, though, it's all been redeemed. That Perez's life and Perez's coming about has been redeemed by Ruth and Boaz. So I would just like to throw this at you, just as a side note, is that your actions can redeem the past, changes the story of where you come from, right? It changes the story of where you come from. And that is how Ruth ends. Next week, by the way, if you're here in the morning service, you're going to get to hear about Toy Story and 1 Peter, so get yourself ready for that. Because we're going to summarize 1 Peter. But like all movies, it goes to black. And then every single movie now, Marvel movies, and all movies are Marvel movies now. There are 17 end credits, right? There's 17 end credits. And so that's what we've got here today. So end scene number 1. I would be remiss if we didn't talk about the guardian redeemer a little bit, because as we read Ruth as followers of Jesus, the story is a little different for us. Boaz and Ruth, but in particular Boaz, represents Jesus to us. So to be a guardian, you have to first be related to the person that you are rescuing, right? Boaz had to be related to Naomi. But Jesus is related to us. John 1:1 says, the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. He became us. You have to be willing. Boaz was willing, but Boaz wasn't just willing. Boaz was in love because he was the second in line, and the only reason he would do this is because he loves and he wants to do the right thing. John 3:16 says, for God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son. God was willing and he gave his Son. He's capable. It's nice that Boaz wanted to marry Ruth and redeem the land, but you have to have the money. You got to be able to do it. You got to be able to redeem the land. And Boaz was capable. And Ephesians 1:7 says, and Paul speaking of Jesus says, in him we have redemption through his blood, the forgiveness of sins in accordance with the riches of God's grace. Jesus is capable. He lived a life you and I could not live. He was fully God and fully man. He died a death that you and I could not die. He rose from the dead. His blood delivers us into the kingdom through the grace of God. Right? We are able to be redeemed because Jesus is able to do it. Now I have, the last one is status change. And I have in parentheses here John 19:30, which is where Jesus is on the cross and he says, it is finished, or the debt is paid. So what happens for Boaz is or Ruth and Naomi, is when he marries them, their status is changed. They move from being at the bottom of the rung to being wife and grandmother, and they're redeemed. You and I have our debt paid, and I love in John 15:15, this is one of my favorite verses, and I just have little bits of it here. But Jesus says to his disciples, I no longer call you servants, and he explains what a servant is, and he says, instead I have called you friends. Which I just want to pause there for a moment, because a lot of times, even at the Village, we talk about discipleship and being a disciple, but that's actually not the foremost thing. The foremost thing is you're actually a friend of the God of the universe, which is not something we spend a lot of time talking about. Right? But because Jesus is our guardian redeemer, we are able to be his friend. But this allows us not just to read Boaz and say, oh, isn't it cool, Boaz points to Jesus. It's actually, as followers of Jesus, we look through Jesus at Boaz. And we say, oh, Jesus makes sense of what Boaz is doing, and Boaz invites us to imitate him. Right? He gives us a very tangible way to imitate Jesus, to be people who redeem, right? Who will redeem others. So what does that mean? Well, there's a couple things that happen that Boaz does. One, Boaz protects Ruth and provides for her. So he allows her to take some of his wealth. So my question to you, and I think Jim kind of, last week hinted at this, but what kinds of margins are you creating in your life that allows people to take some of your wealth who need it, some of your time who need it, some of your energy who need it, right? Part of being a guardian redeemer is that you create space. But the other thing is, part of being a guardian redeemer is taking on someone else's identity, or at least association. See, it's not just that we associate with Jesus. Jesus says to us, I will associate with you. Your reputation, I can assume it. I can hold on to it. I can redeem it. So my question then to you in the way of imitating Jesus and imitating Boaz is, whose reputation, whose way of being, whose social anxiety, social uncomfortability, political opinions, we could go on, whose are you kind of not like, I don't want to take that on? Because I think Boaz invites us into that. There is people in your life where God's saying, hey, no, you need to actually adopt them in. Right? So that's post-credit number 1. Now, post-credit number 2, if you've noticed with Marvel, they're unrelated. So here comes end scene number 2. And I just used some random Marvel stuff. This was one of the most interesting things to me about studying Ruth. This little verse in 1 Samuel 22, 3-4. It says, from there, David went to Mizpah in Moab, and he said to the king of Moab, would you let my father and mother come and stay with you until I learn what God will do for me? So he left them with the king of Moab, and they stayed with him as long as David was in the stronghold. This is fascinating to me. Ruth most likely did not forget her Moabite relatives. David, guess what, has Moabite blood. So the rabbis in the commentary, in the midrash around this, are freaking out. They don't know what to do with it. So what they say is, it's really interesting. They say, oh, you know what? Ruth was a Moabite princess. And so she was related to the king, and so this was able to happen. Regardless, what it says is that David felt safe going to the enemy of Israel, the king, and saying, will you take care of my family? Will you take care of my relatives? You are my relatives. Will you protect us while I figure out what the heck is going on in my own family and my country and how I can manage all that? And they were willing. It's just a really interesting little side note. I thought, you know what? It's a post-credit scene. But last scene. If you go all the way forward, and people have asked me, what is that picture you? Well, my wife entreats you. It's just an end scene, and he's showing the multiverse. And I just put it in there. It has there you go. Sanji and the Ten Rings, it has nothing to do with what I'm about to say, other than it was an end credit. This is how Matthew opens up. And Matthew has the genealogy of Jesus in 3 chunks. And it's really cool the way he does it. But the first chunk, if we just pick it up in verse 5, because we've already read it in Ruth, but it says, Salmon was the father of Boaz, by who? Rahab, the harlot. Boaz was the father of Obed, by who? Ruth. And Obed was the father of Jesse, and Jesse was the father of David, the king. It's not just that Ruth and Boaz were in this epic story to bring King David. They were in a more massive epic story, and that they were part of the line of Jesus, God of the universe. So that moment when Ruth says, your God will be my God, your people will be my people, she had no idea that she was launching a messianic movement and the coming of Jesus. So, your story. We'll end here. Your story and the people that you love, their story is full of loss. It's full of hardship. It has hope. It's epic. And it is destined for happily ever after and has happily ever after moments. Right? My question to you is, how do you tell those stories? And how do you help other people tell those stories? Because Ruth invites us to take a look at our loss and be honest about it. Naomi continually narrates her story, good or bad. God did this. God did this. God did this. Even though she was making all the choices. Right? That it's important as we wrestle with hardship and loss is not to push God out into some sterile place. He is intricately involved in it. At the same time, in the midst of hardship and loss, God continually, and in particular Ruth, invites us to hope, because hope is what the revolution is about. Jesus is going to make all things new. We live in the kingdom, and we are hoping for it to be fulfilled. And it is epic, and you should keep your eyes on happily ever after. And when you watch a chick flick, know that they're trying to capture something. They're trying to capture the way it's supposed to be. And they're doing a pathetic job of it, but they are touching something in our heart. And your story has those moments too. And so we have to help each other tell those stories and be honest about the pain and suffering. I think that's part of what Ruth invites us into. So with that said, I have plenty of time for questions. So if you have questions, comments, thoughts, things you want me to answer about Ruth that we never talked about, etc., go for it. I will need someone who's been willing to run that mic since all the mic runners. Awesome, go for it. Ellen's going to do it. All right, so make her work, guys. Ask me a question just so Ellen can run. All right, Sujay.
You were talking about like how the narration is like, God did this, God did that. I was wondering if you had thoughts on like how to have that perspective and simultaneously also take accountability of your own actions instead of, God did this. God wanted me to break up with you. God wanted me to quit the job, right? Like, so like, how do you like balance both and not just be like, not take accountability for things you do?
Yeah, well, and it's interesting that in Ruth, Naomi never does take responsibility. She just does things and says, this is what God has done. I think because it's a story, it kind of exaggerates that. What I think better than, publicly said, like the example you gave, which is, well, God told me to break up with you, or so I'm breaking up, that thing. I think it's being willing to internally say, you know what, though I have chosen this space, God has brought it about, right? Like the intentions of God are different than my intentions. And so I love the Joseph one to kind of just illustrate that, because Joseph's like, their intention was to get rid of Joseph. God's intention was to save a people. And how that works, the Hebrew people can hold it. They just say both are true. And they live that life out. And so I think I would encourage people to hold both true. I chose to leave Bethlehem. God brought calamity. Those kinds of things. That'd be my best answer at that. Anybody else? Questions? And if we've got an interpretation, it'd be great.
not a very cute interpretation of what it is.
That's right. All right. Well, Ellen, I don't think they want to give you any exercise today. So, guys, let's.
Maybe I'll try again next week. There you go.
There you go. Let's pray. Father in heaven, thank you for this community and for the opportunity just to talk to them. I ask as we sing and as we eat together and as we talk that we might actually just be authentic about the hardship and about the joy and hope, and that we can offer each other care in our stories. And so I ask all of that in your name, Jesus. Amen.